Thanks for giving us the opportunity to talk here with a comparable place. Zubarah has had a lot of publicity recently since its inscription in the UNESCO World Heritage List. In part precisely for the reasons that make the archaeology of the town such a good contrast to Doha, the cosmopolitan city. It has relatively good preservation under the desert sands, rather than a rapidly developing cosmopolitan city. This has allowed archaeologists to investigate large open areas. This seems to jump around. Identifying entire structures and excavating layer by layer, phase by phase, to reach a more complete understanding of the town's development and how its documented history is reflected in the ground. Now I'm going to focus this talk on archaeology rather than any of the other aspects that we see on the Doha project to be so relevant. So bear with me. There's a lot of people in the audience here from our project who can tell you a lot more, so please harass them with questions. Sorry, guys. Zubarah today is a 60-hectare site. It's a site of ruins covered entirely by its own eroded building material and the wind-blown sand from the sea. Taken in conjunction with the nearby fortification, and that's the Mosque of Morea, which was instrumental in the provision of the town with locally sourced fresh water. I'm sorry, it seems to be jumping. Go back one. The immediate activity sphere of Zubarah encompassed about 100 hectares of settlement. Unfortunately, there isn't really that much time to talk about Morea, which was important in its own right. So again, ask questions later if you like. Excavations have been carried out in Zubarah since the 1980s in 3 distinct missions, starting with the then Department of Antiquities, followed by the Qatar Museums Authority, and now by the Qatar Islamic Heritage and Archaeology and Heritage Project, a collaboration between Qatar Museums and the University of Copenhagen. Of the 60 hectares of Zubarah itself, we have altogether excavated about 2.5%, so very, very little. I'm sorry. So we're shedding a very limited, but still a very significant light on the town's development from its earliest beginnings to its final abandonment, and creating in the process a rich material and documentary record. From the very beginning, Zubarah appeared as an intricately planned and laid out town, allowing the identification of residential quarters, of fortified compounds and of defensive walls, of mosques and open spaces. 2 town walls were visible, as you can see on the image there. And conventional wisdom might suggest that the inner town wall was the earlier, and with economic success of the town, the town would expand and a new wall would be built. But this was in fact not the case, as archaeology and survey in specific have shown that the outer town wall was the first one. Now, archaeological work has identified 6 distinct phases of occupation and use, which at least roughly correspond to historically attested activity on Zubarah. I'm not going to go into this in much detail. I'm not a historian and I don't really understand very much of it. The earliest activity consisted of immediate beachfront architecture, which we have only been able to expose in a very limited area so far. It clearly underlies the more substantial Phase 5 architecture, the main architectural phase, in the souk and the warehouse area of the site, which you can see on this image. Keep going back. And future work might show this to be the first stone-built part of the first stone-built presence of Zubarah. That we did have considerable activity already in this pre-urban phase is attested by the multitude of fire pits and post holes and tenures cut into the natural beach sand in what would eventually become the one of the residential quarters of the town. Hundreds and hundreds of pits and post holes, often intercutting each other, were found here, with some containing abundant pottery, shell and bone, and others clearly representing post holes for tent structures or for palm front structures. This phase may be a construction phase for the bigger town to come. So it might be possible to pick this up in other areas of the town, and we have yet to investigate that. But it may very well be this elusive fishing village which has been mentioned every once in a while in some historical sources that existed some time before the establishment of Zubarah as the trading emporium that we know it as now. The majority of the architecture, demonstrating great skill in urban design and social organization, stems from the later part of the 18th century, historically established around 1766, and is, my goodness, and is visible in all excavation areas that we've been in so far. The project has been investigating in very large open area excavations. This is jumping. I don't know why it does this. So bear with me, I'm sorry about that. We've investigated residential quarters. I promise I'm not touching this. Normally I'm really good with this kind of stuff. So we've been in residential quarters, in several courtyard compounds. We've had a beachfront neighborhood of palm front structures, mostly in tents, a market and date processing area. I'll keep you awake at least, and a large palatial compound. This variety of functional areas give a balanced view of life in the city, allowing us to study not just the architecture, but any difference in availability of material culture, of consumption of material culture. I'm really sorry, I don't know why it does that. Never mind. Diet and daily activities across a town that may have been home to about 5,000 or 6,000 people at one time. Full excavation of 2 courtyard houses demonstrated a typical layout of activities in a well-off merchant household. These compounds, those courtyard houses, displaying a typical layout of activities in a merchant house. Now this is doing something weird. There it is, look at it really quickly. Dog-leg entrance, we have kitchen space, we have living space, we have hospitality spaces. It's a very typical layout that you've probably seen in the houses in Doha just as much. Out of this area also comes the famous pearl merchant box, which we seem to be wanting to come to all the time. Made from wood and once covered in textiles and decorative inlays, suggesting that at least one of these compounds was the home of a well-to-do merchant active in the pearl trade, for which Zubarah was after all so famous. A further large-scale excavation of living space, this time of what could be considered the elite leadership of Zubarah, took place in a so-called palace. There we go. Where one of 8 or 9 sections within the fortified compound have been excavated so far, and a second has just begun, as you can see on the map. Some of these features, the same features can be observed here. The dog-leg entrance, dedicated kitchen space, you see the tannours in there, a bathroom, a small date press, courtyards, and access to an upper level or roof space. The compound is laid out very regularly, and while it has not provided a lot of material culture in itself from the occupation spaces, it has yielded a wealth of architectural information in the form of doorways that could be reconstructed from the plasterworks, and arches that have collapsed almost in one piece that we can now puzzle back together. We have also seen a glimpse of the importance of the seascape in the form of these etchings in the plaster of boats and dhows and other features that give an idea of the significance of the sea that Zubarah had to its inhabitants. The largest of these actually wasn't found in the palace, it was found in one of the merchant houses, and it's the logo for our project, so you'll see it at the end very briefly. Excavations have shown that the palatial compound was built before the construction of the outer town wall, and we can see this by this midden which existed between the tower of the compound, and the wall was cut right through it. So the wall was built, historically speaking, by 1794, whereas the majority of the architecture here comes from the 1760s. So there were possibly about 30 years of activity that is accumulated in this rubbish heap out there. Very, very interesting, and we're expecting a lot of wonderful material to come out of that. Excavations in the economic quarter of the town have now exposed the region's largest concentration of date presses ever recorded. We've got about 25 now, and we know there's at least 10 more still covered under the sands. The area was therefore a centralized date pressing and storage district, where tons and tons of dates that were not produced in Zubarah or not in Qatar were stored for the production of the date syrup or the dibs for consumption by pearling fleets and wider population. The date presses were a later addition to the area that was initially probably a more traditional souk space. The date presses before existed in the domestic sphere, and at some point they were removed there or covered over there. This is where they all turned up. Every house may have had one or two. At some point they all turned up in this one centralized area. They were all different. Every single one of these date presses was built possibly by a different person, maintained by a different person, used by a different person. So there's nothing centralized about the building, but certainly about the location of it. The back one. Why did this happen? Can't tell for sure. We can say there was possibly a pronounced demographic change that could indicate a new ruler with new rules, with new procedures. Archaeologically, we still have to investigate this a bit more, look at the material, and see if we can tie it into the historical records. Now, historical sources tell us of great conflict affecting Al-Zubarah, especially towards the end of the 18th century and in the early 19th century, when the town was under attack almost constantly. Eventually, it was fully abandoned by 1811 after some final blow. The population moved off either to Bahrain, to Basra, or back to the fishing villages on the Qatari coast that many people had actually come from. We have limited evidence of any real destruction, as it is shown in some of the historical records, but we do have some limited evidence of burning and of weaponry, like this cannonball that we found near the beach. So there may, in fact, be some truth to this large-scale destruction that is mentioned. Now, after quite some time in ruins, temporary and mostly tent-based activity returned to the beachfront. By this time, remains of the early architecture had almost been completely covered, and the area was leveled, and just some small-scale reuse and resettlement existed in terms of, or in the form of tents, and possibly just some palm structures again. All these things were cut into the surfaces, very similar to this very early exploitation of the area. So there is possibly some similarity there. And finally, in the later 19th century, a smaller settlement was constructed with a smaller town wall, of which you see two of the towers here, there, exactly, which was running parallel to the outer and earlier wall that existed earlier. The architecture was really flimsy, with little urban planning visible in the remains. That pearl fishing remained one of the main activities is still visible in the number of, diving weights that we found in one of the buildings. Pearls themselves we haven't really found, but they were too valuable to just lose. But as it was, the settlement in the 19th century was not long-lived. Zubarah's heyday had passed. As towns, especially on the east coast, places like Fuwairid, but especially Doha and Bida, had taken on much more prominence, and focus had moved away from the west coast. By the end of the 19th century, Zubarah was history. But in its heyday, the town's wealth came from pearl fishing and extensive trading across the Arabian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. But pearls are not all that defines Zubarah. I mentioned already the date pressing activity. Furthermore, we had large quantities of ceramics and porcelain that came to Zubarah from Bahrain, from Iran, from the Emirates, and as far away from China. And we found this in large quantities, particularly in the market and the souk area. The town was a trading port for a large variety of goods. Many attested only in historical sources because they don't survive very well in the archaeological record. But those that do pertain particularly to food. We have limited local agriculture, so a lot, if not all of the food was imported. Specifically things like the dates, but also rice and other cereals, fruits such as peaches and melons, and other pulses. Go away. So Zubarah's fame may have come from its role in the pearl fishing trade, or the pearl trade, and its central geopolitical role in the wider Arabian Gulf. It had quickly developed a life of its own, a town in which fortunes were made and stories were created. The archaeological record has preserved many of them, and further studies of the material culture and the organic remains will be able to tell us much more about the people who lived here in the 18th and 19th century, where they came from, how they lived and how they died, and maybe even where they went to. So I hope this very brief and very confused introduction to Zubarah helps with the context of putting Doha in place, and please we can talk about this more at any other point. Thank you.